be rest assured there's tea at the end of the talk. Slight change, we're trying to finish around 4:30 because a lot of colleagues have said they'd like to talk to the speaker and have more extended conversation. We thought it would be possible to do that over tea after the talk. Also, the clutter of teacups does sometimes disturb concentration. But before we begin, just a few announcements. Our speaker is on his way, but he's been held up in traffic on the way from Delhi University, which he left a better part of an hour ago. So hopefully he'll be here very soon. Just a few announcements. 25th November, which is Monday, we have a talk by Professor Mariam Dosal. This had to be rescheduled earlier on account of a holiday due to Muharram. My friend, Professor Radhika Singha, who's earlier been here as an affiliated fellow. Professor Singha teaches at the Center for Historical Studies. I think she's a scholar of rare distinction who doesn't need an introduction. I still recall vividly recall a review of a book, A Despotism of Law, Crime and Justice in Early Colonial India, which said that the reviewer to do justice needed twice as much space. And I don't think it was only about length, it was about the richness of ideas in the work. Her talk today on Indian labor and geographies of the Great War is self-explanatory. As you may perhaps recall, just around 10 or 12 days ago, there was a very important ceremony for which the Army Chief of Staff came for the three murtis, after which this place has been named. So the Battle of Haifa looms rather large, at least in the immediate history of this place. But I think Professor Singha's work gives us a much larger sense of the historical events, not just in Europe, but in the ways they link into new forms of identity, political assertion, cultural transformation in India. So without further ado, Professor Singha, as and when Prabhu Dr. Mahapatra turns up, I will vanish to the margins and at least he'll check.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this occasion. I should point out that this lecture is not based only on my original research, because understanding that this was a public lecture, I have drawn extensively upon other work in the field. In particular, for example, I've drawn upon work which has kind of talked about interregional connections across the Indian Ocean. That's been quite important for this lecture. So here I'm referring to the work of people like Thomas Metcalf, Sugata Bose, and for the Middle East, the writings of Christian Coates Ulrichsen. My own work has derived both from my study of the passport, the kind of accommodations which had to be made when a compulsory passport was imposed in World War I, the kind of accommodations which had to be made to the management of these various regional population movements across the land and sea frontiers of India. I've also been looking at the non-combatant labor as a component of India's manpower contribution to the war, trying to see how, if we look at non-combatant labor, we get a different picture of the way in which India was located in the war. I'd like to begin also by remembering a dear colleague, Nandita Sahai, who passed away on Sunday. I remember her because it was here during the law conference organized by Rashmi Janaki and Aparna that she actually managed to make the effort to come, and despite kind of severe physical attrition, to actually read out an immensely rich paper. So you'll all miss her very much. In terms of the general interest now, of course, we all try to think of how to write a less Eurocentric account of the Great War. What kind of changes would one have to introduce to the chronological, spatial, and thematic frames of this topic in order to do so? There's a lot of new work which is coming out now, work on Eurasia in particular, work on Persia. Persia was supposed to be neutral, and yet there's been a book by Muhammad Goli Majd which has pointed out how, by becoming a battleground between Britain, France, and Russia, all local transport was absorbed by these powers, all food supplies were taken over by them, the Anglo-Persian company refused to pay for the oil it was taking from Abadan, and the result was that an estimate of deaths somewhere between, at around 1917 to 1919, we have estimates of deaths totaling up to somewhere between 9 to 11 million. So even places which were not in the war were, they weren't dying from battlefield deaths, but they were certainly dying because of the war. Now, if we look at the way in which the war is remembered officially and institutionally, it is a spatial disruption in the deployment of Indian manpower, which is the most remarkable, is highlighted a lot in accounts. That is the sending of, on 25th August 1917, when the first division of the Indian Corps was sent to France. Hindi papers called it the European Mahayudh, and it's been said that this is a reflection of the fact that India had really no choice in the matter at all. Now that is a kind of retrospective assessment, because at the time it was this dramatic disruption of the traditional pattern of deployment of the Indian troops which had caught the public imagination. This was at one level a huge propaganda success for the war effort in India. It also generated continuous unease about the kind of political claims which would emerge from this extraordinary departure. For example, in the official publication, India's Contributions to the Great War, it's only about 10 pages later that one learns that concurrently with sending this force to France, India had also sent forces to the Persian Gulf, to Egypt, and to East Africa. I owe this map to Professor Mike Fisher. Now, this was, of course, the familiar arc of imperial power generated from around Cairo and Delhi. One put in place not only by South Asian military and police units, but also by the cannibalizing of Indian merchant networks, seamen, Indian labor contractors, mysteries, and coolie gangs. The most recent example of this was in the Persian Gulf, where the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, where commercial firms had got permission in 1904 to get Karachi pulled into the Indian Immigration Act, and where, Muhammara and Abadan had, as the British Navy shifted from coal to oil, a colony of Indian workers had built up around Muhammara and Abadan in the Persian Gulf. Looking at this map, therefore, what is happening in World War I? It is in this familiar landscape now, it is along these familiar arteries, therefore, of empire that India would have to supply many more men, much more material and manpower. Now, in this context, Hugh Strawn's explanation for the reasons why the war became a global war is that he says that it was Germany which was enthusiastic about widening the conflict. And this, he says, was not a form of covert imperialism. It was a way of fighting the war. She had to pull the war out into the furthest corners of the British Empire so that Britain's resources were overextended. Britain, he said, on the other hand, had an imperative need to close the war down. He argues that her principal task outside Europe was defensive, to secure British sea routes against German attack. But he says that while British imperialism was dormant between 1914 and 1918, the sub-imperialism of her dominions and allies flourished and pulled out the terrain of conflict. So that is the way in which he charts the trajectory by which a European war became a global war. Now, if we look at an older diplomatic history, for example, Griff's Empire of the Raj, and more recently the work of Metcalfe and others, or James Onley, for example, we see that there are clearly sub-imperial drives which are being generated not only by the Dominions but by India as well. And yet, there's a pulsing contention both in India's contribution to the Great War, that's substantial official publication, as well as in an official publication, Colin Lucas' Empire at War, that the Indian Army was meant basically for frontier expeditions and for the occasional field force. It said again and again it was not really meant for imperial purposes. Now, when does this story come in that it was not really meant for imperial purposes? I think, I'm not entirely sure, but I would locate it somewhere in 1915 to 16 when on the one hand it became clear that the war in Europe was going to be a very, very long one. The plaudits for the Indian Army died away and it began to be said that they had been broken by shell fire. But this force, which was broken by shell fire, was also being urgently demanded elsewhere, that is in Gallipoli and Mesopotamia. It was said that the ecology there would suit them better. The enemy, being sort of Muslim, would be less formidable for them than Gora Log in formidable numbers in Europe. Actually, since the historian always likes to take the long-term point of view, I would say that right from 1878, when 7,000 Indian sepoys embarked from Bombay for Malta, that is the first time that the Indian Army stepped from the Indian Ocean into the Mediterranean, there had been all kinds of fantasies and hopes that Indian manpower could allow Britain to compete with the demographic power of Russia and continental Europe. Now, this was a sort of one-off episode, but if we want to look for another comparable moment where really Britain could sort of congratulate herself on the manpower resources which she had in India, the other moment was between 1898 and 1902. That is when the bulk of the British soldiers who were garrisoned in India had been taken away to the Boer War. There were a whole lot of auxiliary Indian services which were also there in the Boer War, but not very many Indian combatants, because it was agreed that it was inappropriate to have the Indian Army fighting in the Boer War, though the Boer War was so difficult that by the close of it, they were seriously reconsidering this attitude. But on the other side of the Indian Ocean, you have the Boxer Uprising, and the Indian Army, therefore, the infantry regiments and the imperial, native state contingents which were sent to China allowed Britain to actually participate in this enormously diplomatically important business of being present in China along with the French, German, Russian, and Japanese forces. This was another moment of self-congratulation, and what is extraordinary is that at that moment, when I look at the newspaper reports of that period, they had British officers of the Indian Army had no hesitation about arguing and contending that almost entirely Indian force, although officered by the British, was as good as any European force. Now, I'm not saying that the Indian Army was not backward technologically in many ways, that it did not suffer from, various logistical problems, etc. But the point was that the assessment of the Indian Army in 1901 was as a very modern and very capable force, one which could stand its own along with the other French, German, Russian, and American forces which had gathered in northern China. Now, this sort of reliance upon the use of the Indian Army all around the Indian Ocean, from the Persian Gulf on the one side to the South China Seas on the other, is something, and the idea that it had to be modernized to fulfill this role is something we can see very clearly also in the 1911 Indian Army Act, which to a great extent has come down to us very substantially down to us to the current day. When this act was, if you look at the debates and discussions around the formulation of this act, we'll see that the frontier is hardly a concern in this act. It is really imparting sufficient flexibility to these detachments, allowing vesting commanding officers of these detachments with sufficient power to allow them to coordinate successfully with, British Army contingents at all these different sites, which was the driving force behind this 1911 Act. The frontier hardly seems to figure in this institutional reorganization. Now, what is also important is that these kind of regional networks, which were built around the movement of populations from South Asia, various kind of population movements from South Asia, were, as people like Sugata Bose, Thomas Metcalfe, etc., have shown, and I've shown this to some extent on my work on the passport, that these also strengthened trans-territorial communities of opinion, which were based on trade networks, pilgrimage networks, and literati movements. And these trans-regional communities of opinion could contest imperial imperatives. Some of these networks also gave people the opportunity to try and move out of imperial networks altogether. That is, those people who moved to South Asia came into contact with other channels of influence, the influence of the Dutch, the influence of the Germans. They could think of crossing over the Pacific and going off to Australia or Canada. So in a sense, these networks not only gave people the opportunity to, develop what one Turkish historian calls diplomatic relationships from below, but in some cases to try and move out of the frame of imperial service or imperial affiliation altogether. World War I, therefore, was a conjuncture in which all these sub-regional networks operated in these different ways, both to kind of defend the arteries of empire, but they also operated to create oppositional kind of platforms. And in some cases, for example, when we look at the Singapore Mutiny in 1915, it is clear that the regiment, in a sense, had moved out, or was potentially, the men of the regiment were potentially moving out of the imperial sphere of influence. They had become too localized. The soldiers were said to be taking loans from American banks and Dutch banks and to be setting up their own businesses, etc. They did not want to recirculate again within the imperial, along imperial military arteries. Therefore, what we see is that from the turn of the 19th century, and very definitely from the Balkan Wars, along the tangled boundaries of the British and the Ottoman Empire, that is, along the outlying Arabian provinces, along. Sorry, I just watched her. Okay. So, well, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm a bit technologically incompetent. Thank you. So, along the tangled boundaries between the British India and the Ottoman Empire, what you have is a propaganda campaign. So, so-called Muslim landscapes are not suddenly invoked in World War I. They are invoked both by the British Empire as well as by the Ottoman Empire. They are also, of course, invoked by the French Empire and the Russian Empire. And what is taking place is competition in international bodies for legitimacy of rule over Muslim populations. Now, here we have a picture in a book brought out in 1915 by Natesan, which shows you the number of Muslims in the British Empire as compared to the number of Muslims in the Turkish Empire and the number of Muslims in the French Empire. So if we looked at, and you can see this large figure, this sort of Hercules here is the Mohammedan in the British Empire, and this pygmy here is the Mohammedan in the French Empire. So what we have therefore is an intense propaganda campaign. We can see it becoming very intense during the Balkan Wars, and therefore, in some of the literature, I find that the German emperor's effort to participate in this propaganda is mocked sometimes as a ridiculous exercise. It certainly wasn't a ridiculous exercise at all. Everyone was participating in it. Now, however, during the war, this is part of the propaganda exercise during the war, but during the war also the same networks of opinion were also creating kind of a diffused opposition to the war effort. We can see it, for example, in the recollections of Dada Amir Haider. His recollections are published in a book from Pakistan called Chains to Lose. When the war broke out, he got a job on the SS Ferdinand, a large military transport which had been taken over from the Germans. And he was a 15-year-old coal passer who spent a year in Basra. Because the ship was docked in Basra, officers were using the ship as their sort of resting quarters. A whole lot of activities related to the war were going on board ship. And the picture he gives of Basra is of a huge polyglot assemblage. But he says that, for example, most of the people on board ship came actually from places like Rawalpindi, particularly the stokers came from places like Rawalpindi, Attak, and Jhelum. They were talking with Punjabi Muslims who were there in the Mesopotamian force. They were talking with 500 Turkish prisoners who were put on board ship for some time, among whom were groups from the northwestern frontier like some Hazaras, etc. And in this assemblage, they were talking about how terrible it was that they were working for the British, but they were fighting their Muslim brothers. And as Amir Haider says, it's not as though they were educated, but they had a kind of common cultural platform which allowed them to discuss the politics of that moment. Now, as he points out, it wasn't as though, he has to come to terms with why they didn't actually do something about, why did nothing come out of this sort of transnational public opinion developing around sites such as Basra, and he goes through it quite carefully. He says, first of all, the British had mixed regiments. And increasingly, as they realized that the Pathans were unreliable, they shifted the Pathans from the frontline fighting positions to positions in the middle and the rear. Then, he says, they began to discover some wounds, some firing from the back, which looked a little suspicious. So they then shifted the Pathans to baseline work. So, Townshend, who complained consistently that he was, being given the worst troops, etc. If you read Dada Amir Khan, you will find that he had, reason to complain about the kind of unreliability of at least some sections of his Indian troops. He said ultimately some of those Punjabi Muslims, etc., said that when they could, they tried to fire into the air rather than at their targets. But for that too, Amir Haider has a very acute reflection. He says this was not a war where firing in the wrong direction was going to work. This was now a war of heavy ammunition. So this kind of sporadic attempts to kind of fire elsewhere was not going to work very well. What I also want to point out too, and which we have to bring into this picture of India in the war, Nilagri's work has done that, made a beginning with that, is really the enormous amount of animal power which was also taken out from India. That is, we're talking about sheep, draft cattle, oxen for transport, and of course horses. And if you look at it, maybe the war horse, I don't know how many of you have seen this film, but the war horse, Joey, which has sort of sort of melted hearts and cinema screens all over the Steven Spielberg film, Joey might well have, in Basra or elsewhere, Joey might have been a horse from a stud farm in, southern India or Pune or something like that. Okay. Now, what we also have to remember when we're trying to locate India in the war, instead of seeing war as some external event to which India just contributed, is that it's not just by the statistics of men, material and money moving from India directly either to London or to theatres of war that we can locate India in the war. Because the circuits in which human and material resources were generated for empire were very complex. We cannot understand them in terms of a one-way transfer. So how do we kind of look at this? The first is that we have to look at different work sites, what they were generating, whether these could be directly tapped for the war or whether they were being tapped for the war but in more indirect ways. In other words, material resources for the war had to compete with manpower resources. Manpower resources directly for theatres of war had to compete with that manpower which would have to circulate around the Bay of Bengal to generate plantation resources, mineral resources, to keep sea lanes open by operating on merchant ships, etc. And also with the export surpluses which were either going to go directly into war or which were going to generate those currency reserves in America and Canada which was going to provide war material for the empire. I call my paper Labour because labour also allows me to include the labour of women and children in the picture. So at least we can stay alert, even if notionally, to the role of women in this workforce. Stripping away men and children, because if you kind of start looking for children in the war, you find very, very young boys sometimes in those who are being sent out. The stripping away of men in war revealed often the component of female and child labour involved in sustaining an army which had to be maintained always on the cheap. Follower labour in cantonments was possible only because wives and children supplemented earnings. As regiments moved into battle, this female and child component became more visible around cantonments, around construction sites in Delhi. This component of female labour was reviewed by military recruiters. For example, when Brain came to Gurgaon, he observed that it would be good to recruit from Gurgaon because Jat women were so active in agriculture that men could be taken away without compromising peasant production. And yet, what we find is that one explanation for why India could not supply so much manpower for the war was that her women were less capable of substituting for male labour power. Of course, whereas in fact the Jat woman was in fact our version of the land girl. The other thing also is, of course, the component of female labour power in industries which were very, very important for the war, like tea, rubber and jute. So, for example, there's this film which was made about the resource to show how good a film about made by the tea industry during the war. And the film begins with this sort of English domestic scene, and in the course of the film we discover the happy, cheerful women workers on the plantation in Assam, which sort of are producing that tea, which finds its way to that teapot in the drawing room. Now, the existing work in this field has focused a lot on the kind of on circulations around the Indian Ocean. What I try to do in my work is to also look at the kind of work sites the labor regimes, the work sites, and the migratory streams which nourished the military construction complex all along the land frontiers of India. And I've tried to suggest that in this complex, combatant and non-combatant labor was intertwined. These were not, as the Indian Army would have it, separate flows. These were intertwined flows. The same Pathans, Masoods or Punjabi Muslims who might be working on a road construction site or bridge along the northwestern frontier might join the army, might then leave the army. There was a continuous pattern of leaving and then rejoining, though this was called fraudulent re-enlistment, but people generally let it go. So what we find is the tapping of labor regimes which had generated manpower for the military construction complex all along the frontiers of India. And this pattern is very visible. Now returning again to that extraordinary departure, that is the sending of the Indian divisions to France, I return again to the second flow of South Asian manpower to the European theatre. Now the first flow, as I said, was comprised both of infantry divisions and cavalry divisions. The infantry divisions were removed to the Middle East in December 1915. The cavalry units stayed on till March 1918. However, the impression in Britain and even in India to a great extent was that all the Indians had left France in 1915. The second flow of South Asian manpower to this theatre of war was barely noticed. In June 1917, detachments of the Indian Labour Corps began to disembark at Marseille. A few months later, they would be joined by Indian horse and mule drivers to replace British personnel in the ammunition and supply columns in France. We're not talking here about an insubstantial number. The Indian Labour and Porter Corps totaled up to about 50,000. The horse and mule drivers in the ammunition columns totaled somewhere around 14,000. Some of these ammunition, so we're talking here about figures of about 64,000 in this period. The Indian Labour Corps had a relatively short career in France, most of them being repatriated by autumn 1918, though two companies stayed on right till about 1920. But the ammunition and the drivers in the ammunition and supply columns stayed on for a very, very long time. I just want to give you some pictures. This is, we can see the building up of these work sites and migration streams. This is a picture from 1878. These are coolies at Jamrud receiving their weekly pay. On the northeastern frontier also, we have the same phenomenon as well. That is, the efforts, there were, on the northeastern frontier making took two forms. One is to sort of capture influence over routes leading to Tibet on the one side and to Yunnan on the other. Morley had tried to put a stop to this kind of adventuring because what he found was that over here, basically this was supposed to be a terrain where you had so-called only primitive populations. And yet these primitive populations could give very disturbing setbacks to the kind of sort of military promenades which were organized. And he felt that then for the prestige of the empire, they had to kind of push enormous amounts of resources to kind of recover prestige along this frontier. Nevertheless, what you have operating here is a kind of sub-imperialism, if you want to call it, coming from the Assam government, which is one this kind of efforts to move, to sort of capture command over these routes. I better go back to the initial map. Yeah. there was almost a permanent police corps at Sadia. So if you move up here towards Tibet and towards Yunnan on the other side, and the other area where the Assam government continuously wanted to press ahead was in a belt of unadministered territory between the Naga Hills, Manipur on the one side, and the Chin Hills of Burma on the other. They wanted a pincer movement to close this boundary. So these were the two directions in which there was a kind of provincial sub-imperialism which was operating. So what you had in a situation in World War I was where the Assam government saw an opportunity to map its ambitions onto the landscape of World War I. So what you had was that from its most scarcely populated hill districts, the Assam government offered 10,000 laborers, that is from the princely state of Manipur, the Naga Hills, the Lushai Hills, the Khasi Hills. Have I left out something? That's it. Okay. So what you had was, if we look at the pattern of provincial recruitment into the Indian Labour Corps, we will see the very strong mapping of these border networks onto recruitment for the Indian Labour Corps as well. For example, we have 3 companies from the northwestern frontier provinces. Now, by this time, the trans-frontier Mahsoods and Pathans were considered too unreliable for regular army units. But the Chief Commissioner of the northwestern frontier provinces, Roos Keppel, said that, Olaf Scarrow. He said that, he joked that as far as he was concerned, they could go away to France, they could marry and settle down there. Clearly, the more he could get them out of his hair, the better it was for him at home. In fact, if we look at the profile of recruitment from the northwestern frontier provinces, it was actually more intensively recruited than Punjab. In Punjab, about 1.5% of the population was recruited. In the northwestern provinces, about 2% of the population was recruited. Now, these may seem very insignificant figures, but in certain pockets, the impact of recruitment for the Labour Corps could be quite intensive. What is the other area from which the Labour Corps is recruited? The Labour Corps is also recruited from the United Provinces and from Bihar and Orissa. From the United Provinces, what we find is at least 4 companies from the Kumaon Hills, that is from the central Himalayas, where again road working, lumber depots, etc. had created, and military construction work had created nodes of labor. In addition, at this time, the Kumaonis were being considered a new source of military recruitment. Moving further down, now UP and Bihar, they might not seem to have very much to do with the frontier, but already when we look at expeditions along the land frontiers of India, we find that the same streams of migration which were taking the so-called Santali labor from Chota Nagpur to the tea plantations of Assam was also drawing them into road construction all over Assam Hills, and in 1913 we have Santali labor gangs which are also taken along for the Mishmi expedition in Upper Assam. So we can see that the currents of labor migration moving towards eastern India are also being drawn into this militarized construction complex. Now, what does this mean for the Indian Labour Corps? What you had was actually, in a way, frontier walls were circuits were being set up between this militarized frontier and one of the most prestigious theatres of World War I. Though the Nagas, Vishais, etc. were taken as laborers, in fact, in these expeditions along Upper Burma, as well as the expeditions into this unadministered territory, they had basically been used not just as coolies, but as military auxiliaries. This is the Abor War. You can see this mixture of Naga scouts along with Gurkha, regular Gurkha soldiers. So here's an amusing picture of the way in which in a missionary publication, it's very unclear, but they've literally taken a picture of the Naga sort of from Assam and juxtaposed him into the battlefields of France between two missionaries, and there he's been taken off to France under their guidance. Now I won't go into this too much. I also want to point out that one of the reasons why they were able to map this militarized construction complex onto theaters of war, one of the reasons why they were able to do so, at least for places like Kumaon and Assam, were that there were corvée regimes which now could be tapped more intensively for war mobilization. Now, what this did was that what you had therefore was on the one hand schemes to actually recruit more locally, both in Assam and in Burma, were in fact advanced through this raising of the labor corps for France. On the other hand, on the northwestern frontier, the Masouds and the Masouds and Pathans who were taken in the labor corps continued to be regarded with great suspicion, because even as they were taken to France, trouble was breaking out in the northwestern frontier. So to sum up, therefore, what I am saying is that it is the circuits of manpower from one frontier to these other theaters of war which, in a sense, were going to come back and implode along the frontiers of India as well, which is why for us in India, chronologically, the war certainly doesn't conclude with the armistice of November 1918. It concludes with the Kuki-Chin campaigns on the one side between 1917 to 1919, and on the other side with the Murray Rebellion, March 1918, the Third Afghan War, 1918 to 1919, and the very hard-fought Waziristan campaign of 1920. Now, if we are talking here, just a few pictures of the Indian Labour Corps in France. You're reading newspapers. This is in 1919. Some of them are still there in a cafe in Belgium. Is that it? Okay, sorry. Right. I want to talk about some other landscapes which were invoked, imaginary landscapes which were invoked in World War I. In the first group, from certain regions of India, missionary networks, but more importantly, the networks of newly modernizing tribal communities were very important in mobilizing men for the Indian Labour Corps. For missionaries, this was a project which was supposed to make visible that wider Christian ecumeny to which native catechists and laity were told they now belonged. The American Baptist missionary William Pettigrew used an extraordinarily cataclysmic image to claim that the journey to France in the Manipur Labour Corps had fulfilled these hopes. One Tangkul Naga, he said, had come to him and declared that they had had little faith in your stories of lands across the seas, people with beings who believed in the Christ you preach to us. But we have seen with our own eyes the cross over thousands of graves on the battlefield and the beautiful gravestones in the cemeteries of France. So it was that which had convinced him that there was this wider Christian world out there. Now finally, there's another landscape which had to be continuously evoked for pedagogical purposes by empire through World War I. I've already talked about this competitive Muslim landscape which they had to invoke, but they also had to kind of help Indian soldiers, followers and laborers to process their war experience in the right kind of way. That is, they had to give them a more material sense of the landscapes of empire, its geographical reach, its industries and resources. Simultaneously, they also had to reassure them that their very particular community or location, were known within this formation, that they had a place in it. Tours for England were sanctioned for the Indian cavalry officers, and this privilege was later extended to some of those in the command structure of the Indian Labour Corps. But actual tours were a privilege reserved for very few. For the rest, the YMCA used the medium of lantern slide and lecture to help the men to review again the sights and scenes which they had experienced on the journey to France, to grasp the distance which they had covered in their act of, to grasp the distance they had covered in their understanding of the world by the act of coming to war. There were imaginary trips, one missionary wrote, around the British Empire. Men re-embarked afresh on the voyage from Bombay to Europe. They saw once more ports, naval and other war pictures. One missionary pioneer from the Rishai Hills conducted imaginary pictorial tours through the very villages and hills from which these men had come, and they were able to look upon chiefs and other men and women whom they recognized, and all this within 4 miles of the German trenches. However, very different kinds of images were also in circulation about the kind of lessons of war which returning sepoys and laborers ought to take home with them. In a sense, the point at which Indian soldiers and followers, etc., were returning to India from various theatres of the war was also that at which General Dyer had just massacred civilians at Jallianwala Bagh. Macmillan, the same missionary, touched upon it when he made a ringing criticism of the nature of the sightseeing tours in England. He said instead of showing soldiers and followers philanthropic institutions such as Dr. Barnardo's homes or an institute for the blind, they were shown demonstrations in the art of bombing by a Hadley Page aeroplane, as though they had not seen enough bombing demonstrations in every theatre of war, and latterly even in the Punjab. And this is the point which I'm talking about, that this sort of coming back from theatres of war and imploding along the frontiers of India. Even in the soldiers' letters, if you look not only which are the letters which are being written from Europe, but the letters which are being written from troops posted on the northwestern frontier, you can see that the kind of military hardware on the northwestern frontier is now beginning to resemble to some extent the military hardware on the battlefields of France, barbed wire, aeroplanes, heavier munitions, etc. And finally, the question of writing India into the war or writing India out of the war was something which would take place at very many different levels in both the written accounts of the war and in memories of that particular conjuncture. Going back again to the northeastern frontier, to the Chin Hills in Burma, we find that the narrative in, as Lal Dena and others have pointed out, the Kuki Chin rebellion was to be rapidly recast as just a local battle between two feuding tribes. At Hakka in the Chin Hills, the villagers had been forced at that time to build a small pond above the mission compound as part of punitive labor in the aftermath of the crushing of the rebellion along their frontier. Punitive labor had taken men and women away from the fields and contributed to a terrible famine which struck this region in 1918 to 1919. Now, this tank which was built at this time, the tank which was built out of punitive labor, an American missionary, Robert Johnson, says that local people continued to point it out and say, this is our lake. This was made by the villagers from Sakta and other places when they fought the British. So that is their local memory of this conjuncture. Thank you very much.